So we're going to start, I guess, by, oh, there's Lorraine there. Yay, good.
Okay,
everybody can hear us. Okay,
right.
Everybody's here, everybody can hear us. So we're just going to start with kind of show you the agenda. And we're going to talk a little bit about, this is our plan for the day. We're going to try and do this in about a half an hour and then leave some time for questions. So we've introduced ourselves. For those of you who joined us late, I'm Wendy Driscoll, and I'm the Social Studies Project Lead here.
And I'm Matt Murphy, French Immersion Math and Science Consultant.
So we do a lot of curriculum planning, and we get a chance to talk to a lot of teachers, and we've had lots of teachers in working with us. And one of the things that has come up quite often is inquiry-based learning. So we were asked if we could tell you a little bit about inquiry-based learning, and we're going to start by getting you to do a little survey. So I am going to start a survey for you in the Minds On Activity survey questions. So there's 2 survey questions, and they should pop up now. It's an active survey, and if you can agree or disagree with each of those, then we'll be able to see the results populated. Cool. Yeah, so you can see it as it goes. First question, agree or disagree, inquiry-based learning is hard to assess. And number 2, agree or disagree, students need the facts before they can start inquiring. Yeah. Good. Oh, hi, Christina. I see your name just popped up. We're doing a survey. Oh, and now they've answered. All right. So there we go. 100% of everybody has done it. So what we have then is we've got, in answer to question 1, or statement 1, inquiry-based learning is hard to assess. We have 10 out of 13 people saying that's false, it's not hard to assess, and 3 people saying yes, it is hard to assess, agreeing. And in the second question, which is on agree or disagree, students need the facts before they can start inquiring. Most people disagree, 12 to 13, and 1 person agreed that they do need the facts before they start. So those are our 2 sort of themes, I guess, in today's discussion. And the way we're going to do it is Matt is going to take theme number 1, talk about that, and I'm going to take theme number 2 and talk about that. So, take it away.
Great. So we can, actually go ahead to the PowerPoint.
Okay.
And the survey.
Okay. And the survey.
Right above.
Yep.
Good. So it's surprising, but it's not surprising. We're seeing a lot of people saying false. As you can see from our list there on the itinerary of dispelling myths, it seems like they're myths that maybe you folks already know are myths. So that might allow us to speed through our presentation a little bit and get to the question and answer part. But we do want to spend a little bit of time on it just to kind of give some ideas on how to overcome some obstacles that people see with project-based and inquiry-based learning.
Yep.
Oh, we did want to talk about.
Yeah, so we found this really neat quote that comes from one of our favorite books. I'll tell you a little bit about that after. And it tells us that learning through inquiry is both a teaching method and a skill for students that harnesses natural curiosity and wonder. So it's we really like that because it kind of brings in not just the teaching piece, but what we're developing in our students.
Yeah, it reminds us of that whole two-way street thing too, right? That the teaching and learning are happening at the same time. That teaching isn't necessarily learning unless the student is involved as well. Right. So here are 4 obstacles that that I've heard in talking to people about project-based learning and inquiry-based learning. Meeting outcomes. If we're going to do inquiry-based learning, how are we supposed to meet the outcomes? There's not enough time to do inquiry. There's no structure when you're doing inquiry. And as the question at the start said, it's too hard to assess. So those are some of the common obstacles that we've heard about, that I've heard about. And as we said, we're looking at dispelling myths. So I'm going to kind of pick these apart one by one is the point.
Okay, good.
So we've got a little infographic here with regards to IBL, obstacles and solutions. So the question that I hear is, how do I meet outcomes if students choose the content? Now, what do I mean by students choosing the content? When we're talking about inquiry-based learning, it's student-driven. We know that students are at the center of inquiry-based learning, and that the term here is student voice and choice. The students have a choice in what they're doing. Their voice gets heard. So if students are choosing what they're interested in, how am I going to learn about the outcomes, or how am I going to make sure that the students achieve the outcomes that I'm required to cover in my class? The short answer is use the outcomes as the starting point. So if we are doing true open inquiry, yes, the students are going to pick something that may be way off base, or they might pick something that falls within the outcomes. But what we want to do is provide some structure, and we'll get to structure a little bit later, but we want to give some framework, I guess, for the students to work within. So if the outcomes are the starting point for the inquiry, that allows us to do inquiry at the same time as meeting the outcomes, which feeds into our second question as well. So I kind of get them lined up together there. How will I find the time to do a project and do inquiry and cover all the outcomes? Again, if you're connecting the inquiry to the curricular goals, then the time it takes, yes, no doubt, inquiry takes time. You got to give students time to develop their questions, investigate their questions, refine it, go through it again. It's a whole iteration process. You're doing things over, making lots of mistakes, correcting the mistakes. It takes time, no doubt. But it's time well spent. It's developing important critical thinking skills, research skills, and if your inquiry is connected to the outcomes, you're still doing work that you're going to be able to comment on, you're going to be able to observe, and you're going to be able to collect all sorts of assessment data through your conversations with the students. So it's all time well spent. So structure is the other thing. When people hear inquiry-based learning, sometimes they think, oh, it's just a free-for-all. The students are going to do what they want, they're going to study what they want, they're going to present it how they want, and it's just madness in the classroom. Yeah. That's not what it has to be. That is what it can be, if that's what you're looking for. But that doesn't have to be what it is. You can provide structure while keeping things individualized. Right from the get-go at the top, we said the outcomes. If you're doing your inquiry within a certain unit in science or social studies, you've already provided some bit of structure. You've already provided sort of an area that we're going to be studying, and that's going to limit the content. Once it comes to what they're going to produce, you can change that in different ways. So there's two ways that I like to look at this structure, and that's what I call the front-end IBL and the back-end IBL. So the front end is when you are providing your guidance and you are providing the structure at the beginning. So you're providing the context, and that would be the outcomes. We're going to talk about climate change, or we're going to talk about geology or erosion. You're giving them somewhere to work within that's going to connect with the curricular outcomes. But they're going to decide the format. The students are able to use their interests. Maybe they may not be super psyched about erosion, but if they can present that in a way that's meaningful to them, then suddenly it becomes something that's a lot more engaging. Maybe they want to do a podcast because they're really into YouTube and they want to be a YouTuber when they grow up, so they want to practice recording and making videos. Maybe they are more into artistic representations and they want to do a model or a diorama. If you leave that piece open rather than the traditional project, we're all making posters, we're all making PowerPoints, that side of things will kind of be too restrictive. But if you give them that openness when you've restricted the content, then it makes it a little more engaging for the students. The back-end IBL is just the switch of that. That's when you are saying, okay, well, we are going to do a poster, or we're going to do a video or stop motion animation. But what you do is up to you. This sort of style works a lot better in our specialist courses. If you're doing family studies, tech ed, phys ed, when you have a certain activity or a certain skill or a certain tool, those sort of things that you want to assess. If I'm thinking of tech ed and you want to do communications technology and you want to get them to make a multimedia video about something that's interesting to you. So coming back to in the same way we looked at the front end IBL, if they're not really into making a video, but they're super into skateboarding or they're really into basketball, they're going to be into that content piece and they're going to be able to do the video because they're so into the content. Well, a video or a poster or whatever it might be. If you're looking in family studies and we're going to make some form of clothing and they might not be really into sewing, but you can tie that to something, you want to make a hat, or you want to make a toque, or you want to make a pair of shorts, or those type of clothing things might not be interesting, but if you say, okay, well, what sort of patterns do you want to do, or what logos do you want, or looking into the things that they're interested in, then you're going to get a little bit more of that buy-in. You're allowing the students, the phrase I used here is to geek out. There's a link at the bottom of this image to one of the IBL sort of go-to gurus named John Spencer, and that's one of the terms he uses. That when students get a chance to geek out on something, they are much more engaged and they're going to have much more meaningful learning when the topic is something that they really want to engage with. I did see a couple discussion things pop up. I don't know if they're questions or not. I want to take a little pause there. Oh, it's people losing their internet. Sorry.
I think it's, yeah.
Okay.
Let's do this and then we'll have time.
So assessment, that was our question. So how can I possibly assess 30 different projects? And that's on the back end or the front end IBL. If we're all doing the same topic but doing it in different ways, how can I make a rubric that works for a PowerPoint, that also works for a model, that also works for a podcast? The answer to that is that we are looking at the process, not the product. This is not making a poster. The poster is the medium for the message, for the content that we want the students to learn, and what we want them to show us that they've learned. We want to look at the skills they develop, the critical thinking that they do, the discussions, the questions they ask, how they engage with one another, how they collaborate. These type of skills are really the goal of inquiry-based learning. It's what we want the students to develop. So we don't need to worry about making a rubric or an assessment guide that suits a poster or that suits a PowerPoint. We want to see what sort of skills are being developed, what sort of questions did you ask, what was the content that we wanted to learn, what was the outcome that we were targeting here. And you can pull out pieces of that outcome, or you can look at the outcome on the whole scale and see if they've demonstrated understanding. That's really what we've always looked at. The other part of that is the triangulation piece. We know as educators we're always trying to get assessment data from different directions. We want to get our conversations, observations, and product, and we want to have that balance. So the product, yes, at the end there is going to be a product, and we can assess that, but when we're looking at those specialist courses, we may actually be looking at the product of the video. We might be looking at the design elements of the video because that's the outcome that we're targeting. But if we're in a science class, the video itself is not what we're going to be assessing. It's the content of the video when we're looking at that product. And when we've been looking at the process the whole way through, we're going to see the conversations as they're working. You can maybe sit down with a group and say, well, where are you struggling? What are the problems you're having? What sort of things are you meeting as an obstacle? What sort of questions do you need answered by me, or what sort of questions do you have that are going to guide how you continue with your inquiry? And obviously the observations that you're going to make as an educator walking around the classroom or the space or the field trip, because there's so many different ways to engage in the inquiry process. It's not going to be entirely classroom-based, and you can make observations on how the students are working together and how they're dealing with their struggles, whether they're giving up, whether they're finding new ways to get through their questions. All those skills, the perseverance and the critical thinking, That's really what we want students to develop with inquiry-based learning, and that's what's so great about inquiry-based learning is that it really offers students the opportunity to develop those skills.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Matt before I move on? Greg said, good point, does not matter how students represent their learning. Assessment is easy if it's clear what the students are being asked to know, show, or know, do, and demonstrate. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is if we were looking at the outcome, particularly at the skills within the outcome, what are we asking students to know, do, and demonstrate, or know, show, and do? That becomes a lot easier when we try and look at it as this big inquiry-based learning project, and there's so many different things going on. That does seem intimidating. Mm-hmm. And in all honesty, there is a lot of front-end loading from the teachers, developing the processes that are going to allow the students to know what's expected of them. But on the assessment end, when the students have completed, the assessment actually becomes quite easy because the students have known all along what was expected of them. And then it becomes really easy for you to assess because you've given clear criteria right from the start. Thanks, Greg.
A huge feel or need to assess just the product, and that is where the assessment is hard, to compare or assess the song or lyrics or poster or podcast. So yeah, exactly what Matt was saying, that if we only wait till the product at the end to do those assessments, then it is going to be a challenge to assess because everybody's going to be showing their learning perhaps in different ways. But the whole idea is to capture that as they go, and that's what the skill development is about. So if they're struggling, as Matt said, we're having a situation where we can talk about the skills we use for problem solving, and that's really a whole piece of it.
And if we want to look at the time piece again, if you're waiting to the end and then you have 30 projects to assess, that's a lot of work.
That's a bad weekend.
But at the same time, if as you're assessing along the way, you might look at group one and say they've already demonstrated thorough knowledge of this outcome.
Or they're being really collaborative.
They're being really collaborative. And we're getting to the end of the project, and I already know what their mark is. I know how I've assessed them as they've gone through, and if that video comes out, it's poorly edited and it's choppy, I know that content's there, and I'm still, because I'm not assessing the video that the sound cut out halfway through. That doesn't matter because they've already demonstrated it. So I've already been able to assess them 2 weeks before the project was due. Whereas another group, I might have gone by and said, okay, you're working through it, and I really need to see your podcast to know that you've understood and you've learned what you needed to learn here. So that makes it a little less work on the tail end because you've been able to do some assessing all the way through. Yeah, great point, Greg. The product is the celebration of learning.
And maybe a bit of evaluation. Or not. Yeah.
The celebration of learning is a great thing because really any sort of learning should end with that celebration piece. That's a key part of IBL. Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk about two things that come up when I'm talking to teachers, and one is that they need to learn it first and then they can go inquire about it, or the other kind of way of looking at it is how can they ask questions about stuff that they don't know. And so I hear that a lot from people, so I wanted to reassure people that those are really common viewpoints, and that not everybody needs to do everything the same. So it's not an unexpected viewpoint for people to think, well, how can they ask these really good questions? They don't really know anything about it from the start. And that's really not what we're suggesting that people do. A colleague of mine teases and calls inquiry, he says it's not free-range education. So it's not like just go out there and find something to learn. So there is guidance on the part of the teacher. There's a structure and there's also accountability. So I made this little graphic. I put the quote there, and this comes from, I mentioned earlier, one of our favorite books. And this is called IQ, A Practical Guide to Inquiry-Based Learning, and it is available in French as well. And this book is actually part of the package for the teachers' resources for the new Citizenship 9 curriculum, so all the Citizenship 9 teachers are getting this anyway. But for those of you who aren't teaching that next year, we are in the process of putting it on the ALR. So it's already been approved, obviously, for sending it out to the grade 9. So we're going to list it separately if people want to look at maybe getting notes for their school. or maybe their staff room. It's a really good book. It's organized really well. And like I said, it's available in English and French. And I use that book quite a bit when I was working, when I'm working with teachers. And the thing I really like about it is how they explain different kinds of inquiry. So I put this kind of on a scale. You can see the colors get darker. And the first kind of inquiry is guided inquiry. And guided inquiry is the type of inquiry where the teacher is assisting throughout the whole process. That's where you would select the question that you might be doing. You would provide maybe some of the resources. You would model critical analysis. So you might pick one of those resources and discuss with your class whether it was biased or not. And you would select the ways that they were able to present. So you might say, you might give a choice. You might say everybody's going to do a presentation, or everybody's going to do something, or here's your two choices, one or the other. So it's guided. The teacher has a lot of input and assistance, and this is really good for teachers and students who are just starting to learn inquiry skills. So if haven't really tried doing inquiry with your students, you might just want to do this because you don't have to let go a whole lot, and they don't have to take on a whole lot if they're not comfortable with that yet.
In fact, when you look at the research and the big names in inquiry-based learning who are writing books and everything, every one of them that says, start small.
Oh, yeah.
When you try and jump right in and do a full inquiry-based project, when students haven't been given those guidelines and scaffolded towards that style of learning, it's going to crumble and fall.
Yeah, don't jump in the pool.
Yeah, and that often scares people away. So
yeah.
Start small and build your way up.
Yeah. So for me as a social studies person, an example that I might use if I were to do a guided inquiry, or when I was doing more guided inquiry, I might ask my students maybe we were studying something in geography, so how do people contribute to natural disasters like the fire in Fort McMurray? So I might be really specific, so that's the question, and maybe we're going to go out and look at some different kinds of answers. Or I might ask them, what are some consequences of the residential school system that are still experienced today? So it's very guided, and that's the idea with guided inquiry. So I would suggest that it's a really good place to start, where we pre-select some of the questions, or we have some choice. The students are able to do some inquiry on that on their own, but the teacher is very much involved. So that's what guided inquiry is. Most people have done guided inquiry just by the nature of being a teacher. Blended inquiry is actually probably the most common, and this is the middle of the two extremes. So blended inquiry takes some of the aspects of guided inquiry, so the teacher's still involved. There's still conversations with the student all along the way, and the teacher decides where to give students autonomy. So like Matt was saying earlier, maybe the teacher suggests a range of things that they can do to produce something at the end, but maybe they leave the demonstration part completely up to the students. So they have autonomy in choosing how they show their learning, but maybe the teacher is suggesting some of the themes or some of the inquiry questions. So you get to decide where the explicit teaching comes in, and that really speaks to knowing your class and the students having practiced some of those inquiry skills with you through mentoring before you sort of let them go. So going back to my examples, I might, if I was doing more of a blended inquiry with the natural disaster theme, I might ask them, what can be done about natural disasters, or how can we be more prepared? And that way it might give the students some freedom to choose the kind of natural disaster. Is it something that is influenced by humans, and so on. So they would have some choice. Or I might ask them about intended and unintended consequences of residential schools. So they might be able to look at some of those consequences and present that in a way that is meaningful to them. The open inquiry, which is the one that I think sometimes scares people away. And again, this is something that is, we're working up towards it. And this is the kind of inquiry where students choose the question and they design and conduct their investigation independently. So this works really well for teachers and students who've had a lot of practice. So yeah, it's not find your desk. It's it's come on in and here's a theme, and where you want to go with that is up to you. It doesn't mean the teacher sits back and just waits for everything to come in at the end. So you're still involved in checking in and helping with, finding sources or making sure that they're still on track. But an open inquiry is much more sophisticated. Don't start here. So if you haven't done any kinds of types of inquiry, I would definitely start with guided inquiry. I would think that a lot of people have already done lots of different kinds of guided inquiry, and so blended inquiry is probably a really a good next step. What we see here, and I just wanted to sort of highlight this, as you go through these steps, what this is a gradual release of responsibility. And so you're moving from this model of I do and you watch, or I do and you help, to I do and you help, or you do and I help, to you do and I watch. And so that's sort of what that gradual release of responsibility is. By knowing who your students are and knowing what works best for them, what works best for you, this is the kind of thing that you would find through the culture of your classroom. So here's an example that that came from my own teaching. So just talking about kinds of government. You know what you want to teach. You know what the goals are in terms of what the outcomes could be. So you can talk about the criteria of what is a good government. Students could inquire about different roles in government, but then maybe you're allowing them to have some freedom with what they would do to show you what they're going to do. So I've done that with government units where students take on the role, for example, of somebody in government. I had a really good example that I've used in other sessions on hurricanes, and I think that's actually where natural disaster idea came from. But instead of giving notes on all the aspects of a hurricane, we used to pretend one was coming and we had to get ready for it, so we had to find out what we needed to know. So how fast are the winds, and where, what about water level, what about wind speed, and what about barometric pressure and things like that. So you know what you want those criteria to be. You know the things that they, the pieces that will put that together, and those are the things that you start with. So you don't just come in and say, okay, everybody, find out something about hurricanes. You can front load that a little bit and then let them do that inquiry. This is not the only way that we would ever think that anybody would teach. So I just want to say that as well. So when we say that curriculum is, inquiry-based or moving in an inquiry-based direction, what we mean by that is that we're trying to encourage those opportunities where student inquiry can be the focus of something that you're learning in class, that they can learn by finding those things out. The other ways that you teach other things by demonstrating through all the other kinds of ways that you might be teaching something, those are part of that suite of tools in your tool and strategies in your toolbox. And I guess I would end by saying that it took me a long time to not be the hardest working person in the room. And I always say that to people, that really the kids should be finding those things out. And one of my pilot teachers who's working on citizenship this year, she said it best. She said, you know what, it really got good when I got out of the way. So there's that. So we're going to, all of these things that you have here, you can download. There's a download arrow along the bottom menu bar, so any of our stuff you're welcome to have. And so I just wanted to summarize my pieces: the gradual release of responsibility, and when they come up with those things that they're interested in, the good questions and driving questions and powerful questions, that's how they can ask questions about things they don't know.
That was something I forgot to touch on, was how the powerful questions are so central to that student engagement piece, that student voice and choice. Is when they are crafting the questions And obviously there needs to be some learning about that. You need to teach them what makes a good question, right? Should we looking for yes and no questions, or yes and no questions that strict that never works, or does the right yes and no question maybe cause a little bit of inquiry? One of the things I said is that a good inquiry question is going to create more questions. That's kind of my very broad general statement on how to create a powerful question, is that the only way to answer that is to ask more questions.
So, we're going to stop for questions, speaking of questions, if they're good questions. No. So, I know a lot of you are on without a microphone, so feel free to type a question. We'll keep our eye on that, and in the meantime, we'll put up our contact information. Feel free to contact us anytime. Greg says, so well said, use the right tool for the purpose, enhancing motivation and interest, so many levels of inquiry. So if anyone has any questions, we've got about 9 minutes left, and we'd love to answer some questions for you. Don't be shy. Sadie's been in and out.
Yeah.
She's there now. All right, Sadie said, thanks for a great talk. You're welcome, Sadie. One of the things that that comes up a lot when we're talking about questions is when we're talking about how you can ask questions about something that you don't know, is what really makes a good question. And so maybe questions, as Matt said, that provoke other questions. Any question that's an invitation to think. So it might be a question that you can answer yes or no to, but if it's an invitation to think and to embrace confusion and to embrace the curiosity. So when you are looking at something, when students are looking at something, they are curious or confused, and that's where those really good questions come from as well.
You got to think of some of the times where you've learned something that when somebody told you something, and you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting, and maybe it was interesting enough that you remembered it 3 weeks later. But those times when you couldn't figure something out, you couldn't figure it out, and then all of a sudden there's that light bulb moment, like how good that felt and how you remembered that, right? There's that piece of inquiry-based learning that where it is you discovering the answers that makes the learning more meaningful and more lasting.
Eleanor asked a question. She said, is there an age that you would consider too young for this type of project? And does it make sense for a classroom with a lot of EAL students? So I would say that I don't think there's any age that's too young for inquiry. I think what you do in terms of the product might be more age appropriate at different levels. We're both junior high teachers. So we would definitely use inquiry in junior high, but inquiry is something that is so natural when they're small.
Oh, yeah. And
so embracing that and allowing them to have that time to answer questions when they're young. I don't think there's an upper age limit either, although sometimes and this kind of speaks to Greg's question, which is next, it kind of speaks to that, well, I got to get all this done because they're in grade 12, and, there's that expectation. Does it make sense for a classroom with a lot of EAL students? That's a tough one because and I would say yes, it still makes sense. I think it makes sense for students who have adaptations. I think it does make sense for students who are just learning the language. The things that they can inquire into, and maybe the level at which they can converse, will definitely change depending on their learning abilities or their language level. But I think that it can still be done because they can still show you what they've learned in a way that shows their understanding and their demonstration of their learning.
This kind of affects the French immersion side of things too. We've had this conversation at length, is when you're doing the inquiry, if you really want students to be engaged in something that they are interested in, but you need to provide it in French because we're doing French immersion, well, suddenly you can't possibly know what they're interested in, so you can't provide those materials or those learning spaces ahead of time. And we've toyed the idea, well, are you able to go and research that in English first, and then we don't want to turn it into a translation assignment. So there's that fine line that the student may do their research in English for a French immersion student. So in this case, for an EAL student, they may do their research or even develop a project in their primary language, and then either do this as a translation assignment, and you can look at that piece, or they can take what they've got there and then using the language they have, rather than translating it, okay, I learned all of this in my native tongue, and now this is how I might not be able to explain it fully, and that may be frustrating for them, but it's going to offer them an opportunity to use English language to explain something that they are interested in. And in my experience, the students, when I taught abroad for a year, and I found that they were, when it was something that we were just doing in class, doing a novel study, they may not have been as interested, but when they wanted to come and tell me about the new video game that they had, they were able to find the language they needed.
Greg said that content-heavy courses like biology, for example, high school courses, time is often cited as a barrier. Can you speak to how inquiry can happen in just a few minutes or in one class period? That's right. It's not always a big question that has to be explored over several weeks. So you could do something, you could be learning about a concept and you're just doing an experiment. You could be looking at the properties of something, and I think that I think Greg's right in that it doesn't always have to be a big project. You can do sort of a mini inquiry. What did you find out? What were some of the questions that came in, and bring it back to the larger discussion. Terry also mentioned that she found Jim Burke's What's the Big Idea helpful for launching question-driven units. Absolutely. Maybe we can find a link for you to add that.
Well, when he's looking for that, I'm going to kind of link Greg's question and Cheryl's question about going beyond Googling, because inquiring in this day and age, 20 years ago may have been a different thing. I wasn't teaching 20 years ago, but
I
was. But when you look at something like biology and you want to do something quick and you want to do something now, but you also want something to be good inquiry process, what you want to do is different tasks. So actually, if we go back to the blended learning, there's just something I was looking at today where students are going to be learning about heat, and there are a bunch of different activities over a series of 3 or 5 days, and they were teacher-given activities. You're going to do this. So one of them was, one day was building a structure, and the next day was hanging crayons off of it and using a hairdryer to melt them to make art. So the product there, the art, was just kind of something that was fun, but we were learning about heat. So these different activities each day were going to allow the students to engage in inquiry. They were going to be doing different activities. Or in science class, we often do different stations. You're going to do something here, you're going to do something there. And actually, this comes back to Eleanor's question. Stations are used a lot in the elementary program, and that gives kids that hands-on opportunity to work on something and to use inquiry. We might not even name it inquiry at the grade 1 or primary level, but that's what they're doing. And when you said it best, they're much more open to inquiry when they're that young. So yes, there might be some Googling. We often think of inquiry as this research project, and research can be part of it, but sometimes doing activities, or I'm from a science background, so I'm thinking of, they're going to do a lab experiment, and then they're going to change the variables, and they're going to learn something else, and then they're going to look at a different aspect, like maybe the same materials, but use a different aspect, look at a different variable, and in that they're going to learn about fluids, or they're going to learn about friction, doing all these different activities that maybe you set up. Maybe that's the blended part, that you set up these activities. Why don't you do this? You give them this activity for them to engage in, see what happens, and that's where they're going to develop questions. Well, why did it happen like that this time and not like this that time?
I think the other thing that that we can consider, and I know that it's easier and easier to look stuff up. I guess part of the any inquiry can be looking at whether the sources that you find are accurate and reliable. So if they do use Google or they use something else like that, to make sure that we're giving them the skills to discern whether those are good sources. But there's lots of other ways that they could inquire. So Matt mentioned experimenting. They could inquire by asking other people. So we would use interview a lot, for example, in social studies and English language arts. So don't limit yourself, I guess, to changing what you used to do as a traditional research project and trying to inquirize it. Yeah, don't limit yourself to that. Let your imagination, I guess, take you to different kinds of forms of research. Cheryl is also suggesting essential question. Yes. So what we can do is this. We're going to. This is being broadcast or being recorded for later broadcast. So what we'll do is we'll add those links that you guys are all mentioning to the presentation before it goes to a recorded situation. I don't know. Did we answer any? Did we miss any questions? Do we have any other questions? I had a teacher who was using inquiry and ended up putting, this is the one that said that it worked best when she got out of the way. And they looked at, they brought people in, they found people who were experts. They did look some stuff up, but they also were able to access people in the community. And I think that there's sometimes, depending on how big the inquiry is or the kinds of things that you're doing, there's lots of people who can too. Issues 21. Yeah, those are really good, Cheryl. I use those a lot. The issues 21, they are on the ALR, and they are definitely inquiry-based resources. So lots of really fantastic ideas. I feel like I wish I could hear you guys. You're welcome, Lorraine. So I don't know, I hope that this answered some of your questions about inquiry. Like I said, we're going to put this one. This is another one that is going on the ALR that we would recommend. So baby steps, and I feel like most of you, just by the answers that you gave at the beginning, that you're definitely on your way. Matt and I are already there. Matt and I have our contact information there, so if you have any questions or anything you'd like to share with the group, we could definitely send that out to everybody. So we'll maybe send out an email afterwards and put in some of those links. But thanks very much, everybody. If you don't have any more questions, then enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for hanging out with us after school.